Some of Amsterdam's most iconic spaces are its squares, which host cultural landmarks, essential markets, and special events. But the city today is nearly unrecognizable from a few decades ago.
I remember maneuvering through traffic, and it was a very polluted city.
Amsterdam, I think the main things were it was crowded with cars, but in that time, the year 70, 80, all those squares are full of cars. And everybody found it normal.
The squares in Amsterdam were originally used for public space, for markets, and for interaction. The transition to using them primarily for movement of cars or parking of cars came after the Second World War. And that's where we see Newmarkt, Museumplein, Amstelveld, Haarlemmerplein. Many of these squares were converted to parking lots. And that's primarily because in the 1950s, the number of cars in the city quadrupled in one decade. The number of
paved land that's usually either vacant or even in use just means occupied by an idle vehicle is producing nothing, although it costs a lot, so it's a drain in that sense. In other words, the benefit that they add in terms of, let's say, access is minimal compared to what they cost. But there's a lot of other ways in which parking craters are bad for cities, and when you think about why people go to cities, it's partly for dollars and cents reasons like work or commerce or trade, but it's also in an attractive city. It's because people want to be there, because people enjoy them. Cities want tourism, for example, and a parking crater is nothing but ugly.
It has become a cycling city during my lifetime, but I know as a historian and as a researcher that change came about by real political struggles.
There's a common mistaken perception in the US that European governments were sort of more enlightened or something like this and decided on their own to improve these situations. But actually, for the most part, the governments, particularly the national and regional governments, were often the proponents of access by car, and it took local people organizing to say, look, enough.
The car lobby brought in a very obnoxious American, a 22-year-old traffic engineer from Detroit, and he, in a very arrogant way, was telling the people of Amsterdam to build urban highways, whereas there were actually very few cars. And it was great because he really organized a resistance.
It started off with a lot of bottom-up action, a lot of guerrilla action from the residents as early as the 1960s, but that was still very fringy at the time, demanding a city that was more for people than for cars. Really, that picked off much more in the 1970s, and that had to do a lot with a sharp increase in the number of car accidents. So as a result of that, people demanded a city that is safe.
What got the movement going, though, and the results going, was a coalition of parent, kids, teacher alliance, the Stop the Child Murder Coalition. They really made the argument that kids own the streets and not cars. And that was very powerful in that moment in time.
Although parking and traffic safety aren't obviously related, what they have in common here is that the Stop the Kindermoord campaign was an effort to limit driving in cities, not just in terms of volume but also speed, in ways that make it more possible to reimagine cities as places for things other than driving.
By 1978, there was an election where a new city government was chosen, and this new city government had much bigger priority on reclaiming the city for, let's say, slower modes of transport, but also public transit, giving power to neighborhoods to think about how they want to design their streets. That was one of the important catalysts to match the bottom-up action with top-down policy.
The Netherlands is a great example of what happens when people get together and act together to change the balance of power.
All these elements that happened everywhere somehow came together in this very specific moment in time. But it was always always could have gone the other way around.
In the 70s, you see a proliferation in Europe of pedestrian space, and this meant taking away parking spaces, but also roadway access to center cities and turning them into pedestrian zones.
I love Museum Plein, especially because people take it for granted how car-centric it used to be. There used to be a combination of a parking lot, but also a short throughway. It used to be called the shortest highway in Amsterdam, with buses speeding up and down towards the Rijksmuseum. And having that space transformed to Green Square with a lot of other features like the water fountain and different playgrounds and a small skateboard park, you really see it be a very lively space. It's really very intensely used, which is, I think, a very good sign of a successful public space.
You want to live, to work, to play, and to enjoy in one place, and not separate those functions.
People like to be around people. And if you make a space that's car friendly, it's very hard to have that, because the spatial requirements of cars and their noise and the fumes they generate and so on just make it hard for people to be in those spaces. But if you have a space that's car free, then suddenly it's very easy, even if it's not very attractive, maybe a couple of trees and planters and a fountain is all you need. People automatically start to enjoy not just going through the space, but being in the space. And that's a sort of magical transformation point.
And I think the good squares is also squares where people from the neighborhood live there, or walk there, or sit there, or eating there, or drinking there.
One of the reasons why the squares are so popular is because Amsterdammers live in very small apartments typically, so that's also the case for me. We live in 40 square meters, so that means that a lot of the life kind of overflows into public space when the public space is attractive.
And now it's the next problem, the streets. Squares already done, and the next is that's neighborhoods and streets like here to get the car out of the public space. Therefore, I think public space is not made to put your car 24 hours not driving.
The challenge is, can we remain a lively city and not just a museum where we have a cycling city inside the ring and outside the suburbs where people do depend on cars, and then it becomes an issue of making sure that the public transit system and the car share and the bicycle share, that all these systems are integrated into a network. Today we have a political coalition, a green coalition, and one would think that now we get all the infrastructure we want. And still, it turns out that old ideas die very hard. I mean, it's not easy to change, but it can be done.